Welfare queens, immigrants, single mothers, minorities, these are the words used as code for Mitt Romney's 47% of Americans who are the takers, who live off government assistance and sometimes eat high off the hog. You remember that surfer dude who was living on food stamps that was featured so prominently on Fox News? Well, on Truthout Interviews is Mark Karlin. He's the editor of BuzzFlash at Truthout, and he's here to talk about welfare, who gets it, and why Republicans use race and gender and resentment to reinforce an us versus them mentality among whites in the American South and throughout the United States. Hey, Mark, welcome back to Truthout Interviews.
Thanks so much, Ted. It's a pleasure.
You know, the latest job numbers came out for December 2013, and it paints a pretty dismal picture. About 74,000 jobs were created in the last month. Now, those numbers often get revised as new data gets infused, but the first breathless look at, these numbers suggests that things aren't going very well, that people are slipping farther and farther into poverty because there aren't really a lot of opportunities for good-paying jobs here in the United States. But Republicans keep hammering the message that the economic woes are due to a couple of things. One, of course, is always Obama. You can always blame Obama. That plays well in Peoria, as they say. And the other is the 47%, the one that I alluded to that Mitt Romney talked about in his famous, or I should say infamous, stealth-recorded speech. These are the takers, the minorities, etc. And this seems to be the narrative here, right? You've got, on the one hand, poor jobs report, or at least a very tepid job report. And then on the other hand, you get Republicans that take to the microphone very quickly and say, the reason why is because it's the takers, or it's because Obama, or it's just because of the government. But yet we fall for this, or at least people seem to be falling for this every single time.
Some people fall for it. And it's primarily poor working class whites who somehow think, because this is a distraction that the Republicans use appealing to their emotions, that the government is transferring any sort of tax that they might pay to the other. And the other is blacks, Latinos, immigrants. The Republicans appeal to the poor white voter base and basically say the government's redistributing income from whites to the other. And that awakens an emotional appeal that's simply not rational. I wrote a column this last week that featured an article by Beth Reinold of the National Journal. And she talked about people she encountered in Kentucky who are white and simply don't see themselves as receiving government payments when they're living off of the government. One infamous example was a Terry Roop who lives totally off of the government, taking care of his disabled daughter, which is laudable. But there's 13,000, not much, of course. That's below the poverty level. And she encountered him signing up for expanded Medicaid that was made available as Affordable Care Act, and he was denouncing the so-called Obamacare as a gift to poor blacks and immigrants and Latinos and so forth, while he was totally dependent upon the government. And he denied that he was dependent upon the government. At the same time, he was admitting to it. And when you say, how could this cognitive dissonance occur? It's because the Republicans are appealing to what Professor George Lakoff at Berkeley calls the framing of issues into an emotional context. So they use words that awaken emotions that aren't rational. They feel that somehow there's a class below them of minorities who are getting a trough of money from the government while they're being left behind, even though they are accepting these same government programs.
Yeah, this started, well, it's been over 30 years. I know that Reagan used it quite successfully in a speech where he talked about a welfare queen who would get in her Cadillac to go pick up her welfare check. And he would often say things in a speech where you're standing in line with hamburger while the person in front of you, meaning the welfare queen, has steak. So there's always been this sort of rhetoric, or not maybe always, but it's been refined through the last 30 plus years in a way that you don't have to even say full sentences anymore. You just use key words to peg minorities. You just say the 47% or the takers. And it appeals to, as you highlighted in your post, to poor whites who look at it and say, well, it's not me. I know exactly who they're talking about. It's them.
Exactly. And even though the majority of the takers, the so-called takers that Romney referred to, are white, and that included people on Social Security and Medicare, the whites, when they're interviewed, and I've read research about this, surveyed, say, well, I don't accept government programs. These are things I earned. So there's a white entitlement that says, well, somehow I earned Medicare or I own Social Security, but blacks and others didn't. I think that there's a tale of two economies here, and that in a large part answers your question. When you talked about the job statistics for the last month being dismal, and they've been going up and down, generally trending up toward greater employment. But the reality is that there's a job picture for those with high school educations and those who have been fired by downsizing as corporations sit on their profits. And those people are suffering, particularly people who have lost jobs and then get reemployed at minimum wage jobs that end up where they're below the poverty level, and they're told if they work at Walmart, some of the Walmarts or Targets, to apply for Medicaid. But the second economy is soaring. The wealthiest, the top 10% who own most of the stocks in the United States, the stock market is at record highs, maybe down occasionally, but in general, it's trending and keeps breaking records almost week after week. Those people are richer than ever, and they also have a greater share of the economic activity, which is to say the profit or the cash in society, than ever before.
You raise a really good point, and something that I'm sure you've written about, but something that I just recently read from Robert Reich. And Reich was involved with the Clinton administration. He had a very good opinion piece that looked at the speed of corporate capitalism and how quickly corporate capitalism can change the fortunes of not just individuals, but whole groups of individuals in just like a second. And part of it is a long-term trend, which has been probably ongoing since they've started, and that is trying to decrease the power of labor unions, try to decrease the influence labor unions have upon things like the minimum wage, upon work hours and work rules and workers' safety. The other thing is that you have, through government laws that have made it completely legal and through free trade agreements, the offshoring of jobs that once paid really well for Americans, and they could support their families and have a middle-class lifestyle and realize that American dream of moving up to the ladder. That means that within a second, your job can be offshored very quickly. And then the third thing is automation. So some of these top 10 percenters that you talk about, they're in technology firms that create the technology that automates systems, thereby putting people out of work. Now, these three trends are things that Robert Reich has talked about as the real problems of corporate capitalism and the prevalence of poverty and how more and more people are slipping into impoverished states. But yet we keep going back to these same old code words of, it's minorities, it's pregnant women, it's the other, as you put it.
There's no question about it. I wrote a column last September about a representative, Hal Rogers, also from Kentucky, who represented a county there, who does represent a county called Owsley County, that has 54% of its population on food stamps. 4 out of the 10 families are below the poverty level. It's 97.7% white, and it voted 84% for this Hal Rogers, this congressman in the last congressional election, and he voted to reduce food stamps by $4 billion. Now, that doesn't make any sense if you're one of his majority residents who's on food stamps, but they vote for him because somehow he convinces them that it's the takers who are minorities, not them, who will be cut from food stamps or have their proportion cut. And somehow it won't, they don't think that it will affect them, but it will, because food stamps are colorblind. Again, this is a diversion. What Robert Reich was talking about is very accurate, although there are other reasons that corporations are not reinvesting in jobs. Part of it is that when you have a declining buying capability of the working class, or what used to be the middle class, corporations don't seek to invest in jobs that will result in consumer sales from that group of people because they don't have the money to buy the products. So the corporations sit on the cash. They have more profits because, as you said, they're finding lower cost labor overseas, or they cut the cost of labor domestically to minimum wage at fast food restaurants or even in the workplace, where, as you said, the unions have been cut out of the picture. And therefore, they increase their profits. Productivity in America has been rising since the 1990s, but wages for the working person have been stagnant. So there needs to be an explanation for this from Republicans. They say blame the other. And the poor whites, who are low information voters in general, emotionally are stirred up by this because this has been something throughout history where there are scapegoats. And the Republicans have successfully scapegoated poor minorities when they aren't getting the income redistributed to them. It's being redistributed to the wealthy 1 or 10% who control the Republican Party.
You know, anger is a very powerful emotion. And I think that when a politician knows which buttons to push to create outrage in society, talk show hosts, mostly on the AM band, and you see this on Fox News, even MSNBC, they push that anger button or that outrage button quite often. It's really powerful in terms of getting people to pay attention to you. I don't know if you remember when you were in school, and it's a long time ago for me, but if there was ever a fight at school, you just heard the word fight, 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 and there was just this mass group around people wanting to see what all the hubbub was about. Not finding out what caused the fight or try to break it up, but they really wanted to see people battle. So I think that when politicians, talk show hosts, people in the media who lean conservative know how to push that button in terms of creating outrage and saying it's them, they know that they've got a built-in audience that's going to believe them because they know exactly which emotional button to push.
Ted, you're absolutely right. And at Truthout, we've covered this very frequently. We try to get a reasonable approach to our readership. The problem with anger, as we know, and again, George Lakoff, Professor Lakoff from Berkeley, discusses this, is when anger takes over, reason can't penetrate. And this is why it's so important for people like Rush Limbaugh, Fox News, or the Republican leadership to keep stoking the coals of anger, particularly among white male Americans, whether they're poor or not. Because if you're so angry and bitter towards something, reason simply cannot enter. And we all know this from trying to talk to people who express anger toward the other. And when one tries to give them the facts, as we've just discussed in this conversation, it simply won't enter into them. They simply come back with more anger.
You know, we're heading into the midterm elections, and Republicans are hoping to recreate what happened in 2010, which was the insurgence of the Tea Party, and they were able to thwart any kind of progress that the Democrats and President Obama were trying to make in addressing not only the effects of the Great Recession, but trying to just right the ship and get policies in place that were going to benefit a larger group of Americans and hopefully lift up those at the lower economic end, the lower end of the economic side, and also the middling side, who are losing ground and have been losing ground. Republicans say that they're very motivated to vote in this upcoming midterm elections because they really want to hamper the rest of the Obama presidency, certainly want to gain majorities in the House, reinforce their majorities in the House, and gain majorities in the Senate. On the Democratic side, they're motivated, but not as much. Now, what I'm curious, just from a political watcher that you are, what do you think the likelihood is for the Democrats and liberals and progressives who support generally Democrats and President Obama to come out and vote during this election based on the fact that what the Democrats and Obama have been able to do to help those on the lower and middling income side have been, I mean, it's been tepid at best. It seems like most of or at least the lion's share of help has gone to the top 10% of the country. We've seen bailouts. We've seen, like you said, record stock market indices there. But now we're at a point where people are just saying, look, I'm just not making ends meet. I'm losing ground every year. So do I vote for the party that I think is going to represent my economic interests, or do I just stay home?
I think there's a lot of volatility in the electorate, just as there is in the weather. We're at a very threshold point in the United States history. We're moving into the point where whites are going to be a minority in the next couple of decades of the voting population. I think that scares the bejesus out of a lot of white people. The issue is, how much is that emotional appeal going to have resonance? To me, in the midterm elections on the part of the Republicans, it's wearing a little thin at this point, because the Republicans basically, for the entire Obama administration, have been obstructionists to legislation that would put more money in the pockets of middle-class consumers. And so I think that's going to present a challenge for them to say that they have an alternative other than just, make the markets as free as possible, because the markets are about as free as they can be right now. And we're seeing that in terms of J.P. Morgan, for instance, not being prosecuted, just keeps getting fined for illegal activity but not prosecuted. So I'm not sure if even that argument is going to be enough to ignite a wave election as you had in 2010, in 2014.
Mark, it's always a pleasure talking to you. Thanks again for being on Truthout Interviews.
Thank you, Ted. It's a pleasure on behalf of Truthout.
Mark Karlin, he is the editor of BuzzFlash at Truthout, and you can read the article which was referenced in this interview called "Kentucky Man Denounces U.S. Safety Net While Relying on Government to Stay Alive." That's on BuzzFlash at Truthout. Thanks for watching Truthout Interviews. I'm Ted Asregadoo. See you next time.